Hello travellers, my name's Damien, and if you found your way here tonight it means you're looking for one thing. You want a story, the kind that takes you somewhere else, somewhere calm. Tonight I've got just the thing. We're going to the Grey Havens, the place where the Elves said their last goodbyes to Middle-earth. Through the slow work of stone and timber, through centuries that passed like the tide. It's got all the marks of deep lore. Quiet, patient, the kind you can get lost in. So find a comfortable spot, get yourself settled in, and let's step into a world where time moves slow, where every ship that sails west never comes back. Let's get started. The havens are waiting. Picture it. The Second Age, just beginning. The sea breaking through mountains, creating the Gulf of Lun, grey stone being laid by patient hands, the sound of waves against new docks. Now, let me tell you how it all began. But first, we need to go back to the end of the First Age, back to when everything changed. The Grey Havens weren't built as a place of departure. Not at first, anyway. They were built because the Elves had nowhere else to go. You see, at the end of the First Age, something terrible happened. The Valar came to Middle-earth to fight Morgoth, the Dark Enemy, the first Dark Lord, the one who'd stolen the Silmarils, the one who'd waged war against the Elves for thousands of years. And the war they fought, the War of Wrath, it was so big, so powerful, that it broke the land itself. Imagine that for a moment. A war so vast that the land couldn't hold it. Beleriand, the whole western part of Middle-earth, it just drowned. The sea came in and swallowed everything. Mountains crumbled into the ocean. Valleys filled with water, rivers disappeared, forests went under the waves, cities that had stood for thousands of years, gone. Gondolin, gone. Nargothrond, gone. Doriath, already fallen in earlier wars, now underwater, the coastal cities where Círdan had lived, Eglarest and Britombar, drowned. Everything. Lost beneath the sea. The War of Wrath lasted for years, some say decades. The fighting was constant, the destruction was complete. And when it was finally over, when Morgoth was defeated and cast into the void beyond the world, when the armies of the Valar withdrew, when the smoke cleared and the fires died down, what remained was less. So much less. The survivors stood on the eastern edges of what had been Beleriand, stood on hills that were now coastal cliffs, looking west at the ocean, at water where their homes used to be. The wind blew cold off that new sea, cold and empty, carrying the smell of salt, the smell of things drowned and lost. Grey skies overhead, heavy clouds, the kind that never seemed to move, never seemed to change, just hang there, pressing down. The Elves who survived, and there weren't many. They didn't know what to do. Some wept, some stood in silence, some couldn't process it at all, couldn't comprehend the scale of the loss. Entire lifetimes erased, thousands of years of history, gone, as if it had never been. Families lost, friends lost, every familiar place, underwater. Among those survivors was an elf named Círdan. His name meant shipwright in Sindarin, because that's what he was, what he'd always been, a builder of ships, a master of the sea. Even then, even at the end of the First Age, he was old, older than almost anyone left alive. His hair was grey, which was unusual for an elf. Most elves kept their colour, their youth, no matter how many years passed. But Círdan's hair had gone grey, a mark of his incredible age, a mark of everything he'd seen. He'd been alive since the very beginning, since the elves first woke at Cuivianen, the water of awakening, under starlight, before there was even a sun or a moon. He'd been part of the great journey, when the Valar called the elves to come west of Valinor, to the Undying Lands, to live in peace and beauty forever. Most of his people, the Teleri, they'd completed that journey, sailed to Valinor, settled there. But Círdan, his original name was Norway. He'd stopped, stayed behind in Middle-earth because he loved the sea. Loved the waves, loved the sound and smell and feel of it. A Maya named Ossa, a spirit of the waters, had sung to him, sung of the joy of sailing, the beauty of the ocean, the freedom of the waves. And Círdan listened, and chose to stay. He and his followers became the Falathrim, the people of the shore. They settled on the coast of Beleriand, and there, Círdan built his first havens, Eglarist and Britombar, 2 harbour cities on the western coast. Beautiful cities, cities of white stone and wooden ships. And there he learned his craft, learned how to shape wood into ships, how to read the waves and the wind, how to navigate by stars. He became the greatest shipwright in Middle-earth. For ages, Círdan lived on that coast, through the years of the trees, when the world was lit by the light of the 2 trees in Valinor. Through the First Age, after the sun and moon were made. He watched kingdoms rise, watched them fall, watched wars come and go. His havens, Eglarist and Britombar, they endured, they survived siege after siege, attack after attack, until finally, Morgoth's forces broke through, destroyed the walls, burned the docks, shattered the ships. Círdan and his people fled to the Isle of Belar, an island off the coast, and there, he built again more docks, more ships, a refuge for those fleeing the wars. He sent ships to rescue survivors, carried refugees to safety, provided aid to the kingdom still fighting. This was Círdan's way. Patient, enduring, always building, always helping, never giving up. And when the War of Wrath came, when the Valar finally intervened, Círdan survived, his havens didn't. Balar sank, Eglarest and Britombar went under the waves, but Círdan himself endured. And now, standing at the edge of this new sea, looking at the water where everything he'd known used to be, he made a decision. They would build again, here, at the only place that made sense. The sea had broken through the blue mountains. The Ered Luin carved a great gulf through the range. Where once there'd been solid stone, now there was deep water, the Gulf of Lun. Lun meant blue in Sindarin, named for the blue mountains that surrounded it. The water was deep there, protected from the worst ocean storms by the curve of the land, and at the mouth of that gulf, where it opened to the western sea, where a river came down from the mountains. That's where Círdan chose to build. This would be Mithlond, the grey havens. Grey for the stone they would use, grey for the sky that always seemed heavy with clouds, grey for Círdan's own hair, grey for the mood of the place. Because this wasn't a joyful place, wasn't meant to be. This was a place of endings. A place where the elves would eventually leave Middle-earth, one by one, sailing west, never to return. Círdan knew that even then, knew the age of elves was ending, the age of men was beginning, and the firstborn would fade if they stayed, would diminish, would become shadows. so they would need a way to leave, would need ships, would need a harbour, and he would build it. The work began in year 1 of the Second Age, right at the beginning of the New Age. The first stones were laid on the northern shore of the Gulf of Lune, where the water was deepest, where the anchorage was best. Círdan organised the work, divided the tasks, assigned people to different jobs. Some would quarry stone. Some would cut timber. Some would begin building docks. Some would clear land for buildings. The population was small, maybe 200 elves, maybe 300, not many. Most of the survivors of the First Age had already sailed west, had gone to Valinor immediately after the war. They'd had enough of loss, enough of grief, enough of Middle-earth. They wanted peace, wanted to go home, so they'd taken ship and left. The ones who stayed, the ones who helped build the Grey Havens, they had reasons. Some felt duty-bound to help, to build something before they left. Some had family elsewhere in Middle-earth, in places that had survived. Rivendell in the east, or the forests, and they wanted to stay near them for a while longer. Some, like Círdan, stayed because they felt called to, because they had work to do, ships to build, elves to ferry west, a harbour to maintain. These were the Philathrim mostly, Círdan's people, the folk of the shore. They knew the sea, knew ships, knew how to work with wood and rope and canvas. And now, homeless, bereaved, exhausted, they began to build again. The first task was the docks. You can't have a harbour without docks, places for boats to tie up, places to load and unload supplies. They started simple, chose a spot where the water was deep enough, where the bottom was firm, not mud that would shift, not sand that would wash away, but rock and hard clay. They cut timber from the scattered woods inland, long straight pines for pilings, oak for the framework, carried the logs down to the shore on carts, or floated them down the river. The work was hard, physical, exhausting, but it helped. Helped to have something to do, helped to focus on the task at hand, instead of thinking about what was lost. They shaped the pilings with axes and adzes, stripped the bark, pointed the ends, then drove them into the bottom. This took teams of elves working together. One would hold the piling steady, others would swing mallets, heavy mallets, pounding the wood down into the mud and clay. Thud, thud, thud! The sound echoed across the empty shore, rhythmic, steady, hypnotic almost. Thud, thud, thud! They drove the pilings deep, 20 feet down some of them, needed to be secure, needed to hold against storms, against ice in winter, against the weight of ships. When the pilings were set, when they stood firm and didn't wobble, they built the framework on top. Cross beams connecting the pilings, joists running perpendicular, then decking laid across. Oak planks, each one carefully fitted, gaps left between them for water to drain through, nails driven in, iron nails made in the forge. The sound of hammering filled the days. Tap, tap, tap. Constant, never ending. Tap, tap, tap. The first dock took 3 months to build, 3 months of dawn to dusk labour. And when it was done, when the last plank was nailed down, the elves stood back and looked at it, and felt something. Not quite pride, not quite satisfaction, but a sense that they'd accomplished something, created something, in a world that had just lost so much. This was new. This would last. The dock stretched 50 feet out into the water, wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other, strong enough to hold whatever they needed. And that night, Círdan walked out to the end of it, stood there alone, looking west, and spoke a blessing. Words in Quenya, words of protection. Words asking the sea to be kind. Then he turned and walked back, and the next day they began building the second dock. Because one wasn't enough. A harbour needs multiple docks, needs space for many ships. So they built another, then another, each one longer than the last, each one reaching farther into the water. While the docks were being built, others worked on the breakwater. This was even harder work, more brutal. They quarried stone from the Blue Mountains, split it from the rock face with wedges and hammers, loaded it onto carts, hauled it down to the shore. Heavy loads that made the cart wheels sink into the soft ground. That made the oxen strain against their yokes. At the shore they loaded the stone onto barges, flat-bottomed boats, rowed them out to where the breakwater was being built, and dropped the stones. One by one, watching them sink into the water, disappearing into the depths, building up layer by layer from the bottom. It was slow work, painfully slow, a stone at a time, a barge load at a time. And sometimes a storm would come through, would scatter the stones, undo weeks of work, and they'd have to start over. But they kept going, patient, persistent, because elves have time, all the time in the world. And slowly, over months, over years, the breakwater grew, rose from the seabed, broke the surface, continued rising, until it stood 6 feet above the high tide line. A long barrier of piled stone, curving around the harbour, protecting it from the worst of the waves, from the storms that rolled in from the west. Inside the breakwater, the water was calm. Ships could rest there safely, could ride out storms. This was what a harbour needed, what it had to have. While all this was happening, others worked on the buildings, started with simple structures, wooden sheds with thatched roofs, just to have shelter, somewhere dry to sleep, somewhere to store tools and materials. But as the years went on, as the harbour grew, the buildings became more permanent, more substantial. They began bringing white stone from the mountains, limestone. It could be cut and shaped, could be carved, could last for ages. They hired masons, elves skilled in stonework, and they began to build properly. The first stone building was a warehouse, built right at the edge of the main dock. 2 stories tall, walls 2 feet thick, roof of grey slate from the mountains. Inside were storage rooms for rope and canvas and tar, for all the supplies needed for shipbuilding, for all the materials that had to be kept dry. The warehouse took 2 years to build, 2 years of cutting stone, of shaping blocks, of mixing mortar, of laying courses, of building walls, of setting roof beams, of placing slate tiles. But when it was done, when the door was hung and the window shuttered, the elves stood back and looked at it, and felt something shift. This wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't just a camp. This was the beginning of something lasting. Next came the shipwrights' hall, Cyrdan's workshop. This was even larger than the warehouse. Had to be. Ships are big. You need room to work. The hall was built long and wide, high ceilings, 30 feet high, to accommodate masts being shaped, to allow for tall work. The walls were stone. The roof was timber framing with slate tiles. Inside, the floor was packed earth at first. Later they'd lay stone, but earth was fine for now. Tools were organised along the walls, saws of every size, from small hand saws to great 2-man saws for cutting logs. Adzes for shaping planks, chisels and gouges for detail work, mallets and hammers, drills and augers, planes for smoothing, spoke shaves for curves, draw knives, axes, everything a shipwright needed. There were benches for working wood, vices to hold pieces steady, a forge at one end for heating metal, for making nails and brackets and hinges, for bending iron into the shapes needed. And space, lots of space, for laying out planks, for assembling frames, for working on large pieces. The hall smelled of sawdust, of pine resin, of wood and work, and it became the heart of the Grey Havens, the place where the real work happened. While the major buildings went up, others worked on the gardens. This might seem strange. Why gardens? Why plant trees and flowers when you're building a harbour? But the elves understood that they needed more than stone and wood, needed something living, something green, something that grew instead of just enduring. They planted trees first, young saplings brought from the forest to the east, birch and rowan mostly, trees that could handle the salt air, that could bend in the wind without breaking. They dug holes in the courtyards between buildings, mixed in good soil from inland, planted the saplings carefully, staked them against the wind, watered them. The trees looked small at first, thin trunks, sparse branches, barely more than sticks. But elves think in centuries. These trees would grow, would spread their branches, would provide shade someday, would make the place feel less barren, less empty. They planted flower beds too, dug beds along the walls, built low stone borders to protect them from wind, planted herbs and flowers, lavender that could tolerate salt, thyme that grew low and tough, sea pinks that thrived in coastal air, roses that took more care but were worth it for their scent. The gardens were tended carefully, watered during dry spells, weeded regularly, protected from rabbits and deer with low fences. And slowly, over years, they took hold. The trees put down roots, grew taller, the flowers bloomed in spring and summer, and the Grey Haven started to feel like a place where people lived. Not just a construction site, not just a port, but a home. The daily rhythm of life in those early years was simple. The elves woke before dawn, dressed in simple clothes, wool tunics and leggings, leather boots, cloaks for when the wind was cold. They ate breakfast together, simple food, bread baked the night before, sometimes porridge made from oats, fruit when it was in season, apples from the few orchards that had been planted, water from the river, clean and cold. The meals were quiet, not much talking, just the sound of eating. The scrape of spoons on bowls, the soft sound of cups being set down. After breakfast, the work began. Some went to the docks, to continue building, to repair what storms had damaged. Some went to the quarries, to cut more stone. Some went to the forests, to fell trees and cut timber. Some stayed in the workshops, in the shipwright's hall, or the rope walk, or the sail loft. The work was divided, organised. Everyone had tasks, everyone contributed. Círdan moved among them, checking progress, offering advice, sometimes working alongside them. His hands were as skilled as anyone's, more skilled than most. He could shape a plank faster than elves half his age, could tie knots that would never slip, could judge the quality of timber with a glance. The morning work continued until midday. Then there was a break, a simple lunch. Bread and cheese, dried fish sometimes, more fruit, water or weak ale. The elves sat in groups, ate together, talked quietly about the work, about what needed doing next, about problems they'd encountered, how to solve them. The break lasted an hour, then back to work. The afternoon stretched long. especially in summer when the days were longest, the sun moving slowly across the sky, the heat building. Though it was never truly hot there, the sea kept things cool, sent breezes across the harbour. In winter the days were short. Work ended early when the light failed, but in summer they worked until evening, until the sun was low over the western sea. Until the light turned golden, then orange, then red, and finally faded to purple. The tools were cleaned and put away, everything in its place. The workshops were swept, the fires and the forges were banked, everything made ready for the next day. Evening meals were taken in the great hall. This hall had been built in the 3rd year, a long building with high ceilings, carved wooden pillars, windows looking out over the gulf, a great hearth at one end, benches and tables. The elves gathered there as the light faded. Lamps were lit. Oil lamps that cast warm yellow light, the smell of burning oil mixing with the smell of food. Dinner was more substantial than the other meals. Stews made with vegetables from the gardens, fish caught in the gulf, bread, sometimes meat if hunters had been successful. The food was good, nourishing, and the hall was warm, especially in winter when the fire roared. The elves ate slowly, no rush, talking more now than at other meals. The work was done, the day was ending. This was time to rest. Sometimes there was music. Someone would bring out a harp or a flute and play softly, old songs, songs from Beleriand, songs about places that no longer existed, songs about people who were gone. The music was beautiful, haunting, sad. Everyone knew the songs, had known them for ages. Sometimes they sang along, voices blending, harmonizing, filling the hall with sound. And when the song ended, when the last note faded, the silence felt heavier somehow, felt weighted with memory, with loss. But they didn't speak of it, just sat quietly, thinking their own thoughts. Eventually, one by one, the elves would leave, head to their quarters, small rooms built into the larger structures, or small houses built along the streets that were slowly forming. The rooms were simple: a bed, a chest for belongings, a chair, a small table, maybe a lamp. Nothing fancy, nothing excessive. Elves don't need much. Círdan's room was no different from the others. He took no special accommodations, lived as simply as anyone. His room held a bed, a desk where he could draw ship plans, a chest with his clothes, and little else. Night came. The lamps were extinguished. The grey havens grew dark and quiet. Just the sound of the sea, constant, eternal. The waves washing against the docks, against the breakwater, against the shore, a rhythm that never changed, never stopped. The seasons turned. The first winter came in year 2, and it was hard. The wind howled off the Gulf of Lune, bitter cold wind that cut through clothing, that made your eyes water, that made your hands go numb even through gloves. Snow fell, great heavy snow that piled up in the courtyards, that drifted against the buildings, that covered the docks in white. The work slowed. Some tasks couldn't be done in that cold, couldn't be done in that snow, but some continued. Inside work, repairing tools, weaving rope, sewing canvas for sails, planning the next season's projects. Círdan spent the winter in his workshop, drawing plans, designing ships, calculating measurements, figuring loads and stresses, planning every detail. The cold lasted for months, deep into what should have been spring. The water in the gulf froze at the edges, ice forming along the shore, coating the pilings of the docks, making everything slippery, treacherous. But eventually, the weather broke. The sun came out, stronger now, warmer. The ice melted, dripping from the docks, flowing back into the sea. The snow melted too, revealing the work underneath. Some damage from the weight of ice, some repairs needed, but nothing catastrophic. Spring was short that year, quickly giving way to summer, and summer brought different challenges. Fog. Thick fog rolling in from the ocean. Fog that blanketed everything, that reduced visibility to a few feet, that muffled all sound. The elves moved slowly through the fog, calling to each other to avoid collisions. Here, over here, by the second dock. Voices disembodied in the white. The fog would last for days sometimes, then suddenly lift, leaving everything damp, dripping. The wood swelled in the moisture. The rope grew heavy. Everything felt wet. Autumn brought storms, great rolling storms that swept in from the west. You could see them coming, dark clouds piling up on the horizon, the wind picking up, the water turning choppy, then grey, then dark. The elves would secure everything, tie down loose items, double-check the moorings on the boats, close the shutters on the buildings, and wait. The storms were fierce. Rain fell in sheets. You couldn't see across the harbour. Lightning split the sky. Thunder shook the ground. The wind howled, screamed through the rigging of ships, through the gaps in buildings. And the sea rose, waves crashing against the breakwater, spray flying 20 feet in the air. Sometimes a storm would last a week, rain every day, wind every night. The elves stayed inside mostly, worked on indoor tasks, ventured out only when necessary, wearing oilskin cloaks, heads down against the wind. And when the storm finally passed, when the skies cleared, when the wind dropped, there was always damage to assess. Torn canvas, broken rigging, sometimes part of a dock damaged, planks torn loose, pilings shifted, and they'd repair it, fix it, make it strong again. This was the rhythm. This was life in the Grey Havens, work and weather, building and repairing, over and over, year after year. Círdan walked the docks every morning. It was his routine, his ritual, something he did without thinking. He'd wake before anyone else, before dawn, dress quietly, and walk down to the water. The air was always cold in the morning, even in summer. The sea kept things cool. He'd start at the northern end, the first dock, walk its length slowly, eyes scanning everything, checking the pilings for rot. Wood could rot from the inside. You had to watch for soft spots, for discoloration, for the smell of decay. Checking the planks for cracks, for warping, for loose nails. Tugging on mooring lines to make sure they were secure, that the cleats they were tied to were solid, that the knots were tight. He missed nothing. His eyes were sharp despite his age, despite the countless years. He could spot a problem from 20 feet away. A plank that was starting to warp, a nail working loose, a rope beginning to fray. And he'd make a mental note, or sometimes stop and fix it right then, if it was small, if he had his tools. Otherwise he'd tell someone later, send them to deal with it. He'd walk the second dock, then the third, checking everything. The routine took about an hour. By the time he finished, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the harbour, and other elves were starting to emerge, beginning their day. After checking the docks, Círdan would check the ships, any ships that were tied up. He'd walk around them slowly, run his hands over the hulls, feeling for soft spots, for places where the wood was beginning to fail. Checking the caulking between planks, making sure the seams were still tight. Ships need constant maintenance. Wood swells and shrinks with moisture and temperature. With the seasons, seams open up, caulking falls out. If you don't stay on top of it, if you let things slide, a ship can develop leaks, can become unsafe, can fail when you need it most. Círdan wouldn't allow that. Every ship that remained at the Grey Havens was maintained, kept perfect, or as close to perfect as possible. After checking the ships, he'd go to his workshop, the shipwright's hall. There he'd spend the rest of the morning, working on whatever project was current. In the early years, the first decade or so, there wasn't much shipbuilding. They were too busy building the harbour itself. But he worked on small boats, rowboats, and fishing boats, vessels needed for daily use. And he taught, had apprentices, young elves who wanted to learn, wanted to know the craft. He taught them patiently, showed them how to read wood, how to look at a log and see what it would become, how to see the grain, the way it ran, where it was straight and strong, where it twisted, where knots made it weak. Showed them how to select timber, oak for the keel and frames, strong and durable, doesn't rot easily. Ash for oars and smaller parts, flexible, strong but with give. Pine for masts, tall and straight, lightweight, and for planking. Showed them how to use tools, how to hold an adze, how to swing it, how to shave wood away in smooth curls, how to use a saw, to start the cut carefully, to keep the blade straight, to let the tool do the work, how to use a plane, to smooth the surface, to take off the high spots, to make everything level, how to drill holes, to start with a small bit, to work up to the size you need, to go slowly so the wood doesn't split, how to drive pegs, to make them tight, to make joints that would hold forever. And he taught them about ships, about how they're built, how they work, why things are done certain ways. This is knowledge, he'd say. Knowledge passed down through ages. Don't waste it. Learn it properly. Understand it, so you can teach others someday. The apprentices listened, watched, practiced, made mistakes, learned from them. This was how knowledge was preserved, how skills were passed on, generation to generation, though generations of elves were very long. Some of his apprentices stayed with him for 100 years, and still felt they had more to learn. Because shipbuilding isn't simple, isn't something you master quickly. There's always more, always deeper understanding. The sea is vast, unforgiving, and a ship has to be perfect, or people die. In the year 15 of the Second Age, 15 years after the founding, Círdan began building the first real ship. Not a boat, not a fishing vessel, but a ship, a proper ship, one that could sail to Valinor, that could carry elves west. This was important. This was what the Grey Havens was for. He chose the timber carefully. Had been setting aside certain logs for years, oak for the keel, the best oak, straight-grained, no knots, massive. A log 30 feet long, 2 feet thick, it had been drying in the timber yard for 10 years, seasoning, settling into its final shape. He had it brought to the ship hall, set on stands, and he began. First he shaped the keel, used an adze, working slowly, carefully, taking off wood in thin layers. The keel has to be straight, perfectly straight. Everything else is built on this. If the keel is wrong, the whole ship is wrong. He worked on it for weeks, checking it constantly, sighting along its length, feeling with his hands, taking off a little more here, a little more there, until it was perfect. Then he began the ribs, the frames that would give the hull its shape. These were made from naturally curved wood, branches or roots that had grown in the right shape. He'd been collecting them for years, setting them aside, each one carefully chosen for a specific place in the ship. The ribs were steamed to make them more flexible, heated in a long box with steam piped in from a boiler, left for hours until the wood was soft, pliable. Then quickly shaped, clamped into position, left to cool and harden. Each rib was fitted to the keel, attached with wooden pegs, driven through pre-drilled holes, hammered tight. This work took months. There were dozens of ribs, each one different, each one fitted individually. His apprentices helped, learned by doing, by seeing how Círdan worked, how he checked everything, measured everything, made sure every piece was perfect. Slowly, over months, the skeleton of the ship took shape, the keel running down the centre, the ribs curving up from it, forming the shape of the hull. You could see it now, see what it would become, a graceful shape, a ship. Then came the planking. This was delicate work, precise work. The planks had to be shaped to follow the curve of the ribs, had to fit tight against each other, edge to edge, no gaps. Círdan selected each plank personally, looked at the grain, looked at the curve, decided where it would go. The planks were fitted one at a time. Starting from the keel and working up, each plank held in place, marked where it needed trimming, taken down, shaped, tried again. Over and over until it fit perfectly. Then holes were drilled, wooden pegs driven through, into the ribs beneath, holding everything tight. The sound of hammering filled the workshop. Tap, 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 tap. Constant, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. Plank after plank, week after week, month after month. The hull grew, and when the last plank was fitted, when the hull was complete, Círdan walked around it, ran his hands over the smooth wood, checking, feeling. And he smiled, a rare smile. It was good. Then came the caulking. This meant sealing the seams between planks, making the hull watertight. They used oakum, old rope that had been picked apart into fibres, mixed with tar. The oakum was driven into the seams with special tools, hammered in tight, packed solid, then hot tar was poured over it, coating everything, sealing it. It was messy work. The tar got everywhere, on hands, on clothes, on faces. The smell stuck to you for days. But it worked. It kept the water out, kept the ship dry. Next came the deck. Planks laid across beams, fitted tight, caulked like the hull. Then the mast. This was a ceremony in itself, most important moment. The mast was a tall pine. 40 feet long, straight as an arrow. It had been selected years before, stripped of bark, shaped smooth, oiled to preserve it. It took a dozen elves to lift it, to carry it into the workshop, to position it over the socket in the keel. They lowered it slowly, carefully, guiding it down, 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 until it slid into place. And when it stood upright, when it rose tall above them, touching the ceiling of the workshop, the elves stepped back and looked. And the ship felt alive, felt real, felt ready. The rigging came next, lines and ropes, carefully measured, stays to hold the mast steady, running from the top of the mast to the sides of the ship, halyards to raise the sail, sheets to control it, hundreds of feet of rope. Every line had to be properly spliced, every knot had to be correct. Círdan checked them all. Finally, the sail, white canvas, sewn in the sail loft, cut to fit exactly, hemmed and reinforced at the edges, attached to the yard, the horizontal beam. When they raised it for the first time, when they hauled on the halyard and the sail climbed the mast, when the wind caught it and it filled, billowed out, white and perfect. Everyone stopped. Everyone watched. And in that moment, it wasn't just a ship anymore. It was something more, something beautiful, something that could carry people home. The ship took 3 years to build. 3 years from keel to completion, and when it was done, when every detail was finished, Círdan blessed it. He waited until night, until the workshop was empty, and he walked around the ship 3 times, touching the hull, speaking in Quenya, the high elven tongue. Words of blessing, words of protection, words that would allow this ship to find the straight road, the path to Valinor. Because that was the secret. Not every ship could reach the Undying Lands. The world had been changed, bent, made round after the fall of Numenor, but that's later. At this time the world was still flat, but still. The path to Valinor was hidden, protected. Only elven ships could find it. Only ships that had been blessed, only ships built by those who remembered. And Círdan remembered. He was old enough. He'd been to Valinor, had walked its shores before the great journey, before he chose to stay behind. He knew the way, knew the words, and he bound them into the ship, wove them into its very being. The ship was launched on a calm day, early morning. The tide was high. They'd built it on a slipway, an angled ramp leading down to the water. The ship rested on greased logs, held in place by wedges. When everything was ready, when everyone was in position, Círdan gave the signal. The wedges were knocked away, and the ship began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Sliding down the slipway, the logs rolling beneath it. And then, the splash. The ship hit the water, rocked, settled, floated. It sat there in the harbour, white and graceful, riding the gentle waves, and it was perfect. Within a week, elves came, elves who were ready to leave, ready to sail west. There were 12 of them, families mostly, carrying small bundles, everything they owned, everything they wanted to take with them. They said their goodbyes to friends who were staying, to the land itself, to Middle-earth. And they boarded the ship, walked up the gangplank, found places to sit, to rest. Círdan checked everything one last time. The rigging, the sail, the supplies, water and food for the journey. Then he cast off the lines. The ship drifted away from the dock, caught the wind, the sail filled, and it began to move. Out into the Gulf of Lun, heading west, toward the open sea, toward the setting sun. Círdan stood on the dock and watched as the ship grew smaller, smaller. And here's the thing, the ship never disappeared over the horizon, never dropped below the curve of the world. It just faded, grew more distant, but stayed visible longer than it should have. Because it wasn't following the normal path, wasn't sailing across the regular ocean. It was following the straight road, the hidden path, the way to Valinor. And when Círdan could no longer see it, when it had faded completely into the west, he turned and walked back to his workshop to begin building the next one. The years passed, decades rolled by, the Grey Havens grew, more buildings, more docks, more ships. Gil-galad was the High King of the Noldor, the deep elves, those who'd gone to Valinor in ancient times and returned to Middle-earth. He'd survived the War of Wrath, survived the fall of Beleriand, and now he established his kingdom in what remained. Lindon, he called it, the land on both sides of the Gulf of Lun, for Lindon to the north, meaning North Lindon, Harlindon to the south, meaning South Lindon. Gil-galad's main court was inland, in towers and halls built in the foothills of the Blue Mountains, but he recognised the importance of the Grey Havens, recognised that Círdan and his people were doing essential work, so he gave Círdan full authority over the haven, made him lord of the Grey Havens, gave him resources, supplies, whatever he needed, and left him to it. Gil-galad understood. Círdan was older than him, much older, wiser, more experienced. If anyone could maintain a harbour, could build ships, could guide elves west, it was Círdan. So the work continued, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The population of the Grey Havens was never large, a few hundred at most, and it was always changing. Elves would arrive, stay for a time, help with the work, and then sail west. Always leaving, always departing, the numbers slowly dwindling. But new arrivals would come from Rivendell, from Lothlorien, from the forests, elves who decided it was time to leave Middle-earth, time to go home. And Círdan welcomed them all, gave them a place to stay, gave them work if they wanted it, and when they were ready, when a ship was prepared, he sent them west. In the year 600 of the Second Age, something unexpected happened. A ship arrived in the Gulf of Lun, a ship from the west. This was unusual. Ships went west. They didn't come east, but this ship came. It wasn't from Valinor. It was from Numenor, the island given to men, to the Edain who'd fought against Morgoth in the First Age, who'd been allies of the Elves. As a reward for their service, for their loyalty, the Valar had given them an island, a great island in the ocean, west of Middle-earth. They called it Numenor, or Elena in their own tongue, and it was beautiful, a paradise. And the Edain who settled there were blessed, given longer lives than other men, 300 years or more, given wisdom, given the chance to build something great. And they'd learned shipbuilding, learned from the elves before they left, and now, 600 years later, they were coming back. The ship that arrived was different from elven ships, heavier, broader in the beam, with different rigging, but well made, solid, seaworthy. The captain who stepped off was named Viantur, a tall man, strong, with dark hair and grey eyes. He spoke Sindarin, learned from his ancestors who'd lived in Middle-earth, and he greeted Círdan formally, with respect. Viantur was amazed by the Grey Havens, walked the docks, examined the ships, asked questions. How do you shape the hull? What kind of wood do you use? How do you attach the rigging? And Círdan answered every question patiently, completely, showed him the workshops, showed him ships under construction, explained techniques, shared knowledge freely. Because that was his way. Knowledge should be shared, should be passed on. Viantur stayed for 3 months, learning, observing, helping with the work when he could. And when he finally left, when his ship sailed back west toward Numenor, he and Círdan were friends. Viantur promised to return, promised to bring others, to maintain the friendship between Numenor and the Elves. And he kept that promise. Over the next centuries, more ships came from Numenor, more captains, more sailors. They came to trade, to learn, to visit. And the Grey Havens became a meeting place, a bridge between the world of elves and the world of men. Círdan welcomed them all, taught them shipbuilding, taught them navigation, how to read the stars, how to navigate by sun and moon, how to predict weather by watching clouds and wind. The Numenorians learned quickly. They were gifted, talented, and they became great mariners, building ships that could cross the ocean, that could weather any storm, that could explore the far reaches of the world. And Círdan was proud of what they accomplished, proud to have helped. The friendship lasted for centuries. Númenórean ships visited regularly, brought gifts, trade goods, news from the island. And Círdan sent gifts in return, sent knowledge, sent help when needed. It was good, a bright spot in the slow, quiet life of the Grey Havens. But far to the east, in Mordor, a shadow was growing. A dark lord named Sauron, once a servant of Morgoth, now rising to power in his own right. He'd survived the War of Wrath, escaped the destruction, fled into hiding. And now, centuries later, he was gathering strength, building armies, forging weapons, planning conquest. The elves heard rumours at first, whispers, stories from travellers, nothing concrete, nothing certain, but troubling. Gil-galad sent scouts, sent riders east to investigate, and they returned with confirmation. Sauron was real, and he was dangerous. In the year 1200 of the Second Age, Sauron came to the elves in fair form, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, claiming he wanted to help, wanted to teach. And some believed him, in Eregion, the elven realm to the southeast. The smiths welcomed him, learned from him, and together they forged the rings of power. 19 rings, rings that could preserve, that could heal, that could enhance the natural abilities of the bearer. But it was a trick, a deception. Because Sauron forged a master ring in secret, the one ring to rule them all, and when he put it on, when he claimed his dominion, the elves realised they'd been betrayed. The 3 rings, the greatest of the elven rings, made without Sauron's direct help. They weren't corrupted, weren't under his control, but they were still dangerous, still tied to the power of the One Ring. And if Sauron held the One, he could sense them, could find them, so they were hidden, kept secret. Gil-galad received one, Vilya, the mightiest of the 3. Galadriel received one, Nenya, the Ring of Water, and Círdan received one, Narya, the Ring of Fire. It appeared on his finger one day, brought by a messenger from Gil-galad, a simple gold band set with a red stone. Unassuming, but powerful. Círdan could feel it, feel the power humming in the ring, power to inspire, to kindle hope, to resist despair. He wore it always after that, though he told no one. The ring was a secret, had to be. If Sauron learned of it, learned where it was, he'd come for it. And Círdan wasn't a warrior, wasn't a king, he was a shipwright, an old elf who built boats. But he accepted the ring, accepted the responsibility, and kept it safe. War came in the year 1693. Sauron attacked Eriador, attacked the Elven realms. His forces swept across the land, burning, destroying. The elves fought back, held the line in some places, retreated in others. The Grey Havens prepared for siege. Círdan gathered his people, brought in supplies, strengthened the walls, and waited. Sauron's forces reached the River Lune, tried to cross, tried to push through to the Havens. There were battles, skirmishes along the river. Círdan sent out defenders, sent ships upriver carrying soldiers. They held, barely, but they held. The river became the defensive line, the border between Lindon and Sauron's forces, and it wasn't breached. In the year 1700, help arrived, a fleet from Númenor, sent by the king, Tir-Minestir, a great fleet carrying an army. They landed at the Grey Havens, unloaded soldiers and supplies, thousands of men, armed and ready, and they marched east to push back Sauron's forces to save the Elven realms. The war turned. Sauron's armies were defeated, driven back, pushed all the way to Mordor. And there was peace again. Temporary peace, but peace. The Númenórean fleet departed. The soldiers returned home, but the friendship between Númenor and the Elves was stronger than ever. Gil-galad and Tar Minastir exchanged gifts, exchanged pledges, promised mutual aid. The Grey Havens became even more important as a port, a link between the island and the mainland. More ships came, more trade, more contact. Círdan supervised it all, organised the harbour, expanded the docks, built more warehouses to handle the increased traffic. The years passed, decades, centuries. The Second Age rolled on. Peaceful years, prosperous years. But Círdan noticed something. The character of the Númenórean visitors was changing. They were becoming different. Prouder, more arrogant. They spoke less of friendship, more of their own greatness, their own power. They didn't visit to learn anymore, didn't ask questions, didn't seek advice. They came to show, to demonstrate their ships, their wealth, their strength. Círdan found it troubling, but said nothing. What could he say? He continued to welcome them, continued to maintain relations, but he worried. And his worries were justified. By the year 3000, Númenor had changed completely. The kings had turned away from the elves, forbidden their people from visiting Middle-earth except to establish colonies, forbidden the speaking of Elvish, forbidden anything that reminded them of the elves or the Valar. They'd become obsessed with death, with mortality. They saw it as a curse instead of a gift, and they resented the elves, resented their immortality. Ships still came to the Grey Havens, but they were military ships now, carrying soldiers, establishing forts along the coast. The captains were cold, formal. They didn't trade, didn't talk, just unloaded and left. Círdan watched it happen, watched the friendship crumble and grieved. But there was nothing he could do. Númenor was beyond his reach, beyond anyone's reach. In the year 3261, the end came. Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor, sailed to Middle-earth. He captured Sauron, brought him back to the island as a prisoner. But Sauron corrupted him, poisoned his mind, convinced him to attack Valinor itself, to sail west, to wage war against the Valar, to claim immortality by force. And Ar-Pharazôn, fool that he was, listened, built a great armada, the largest fleet ever assembled, and sailed west. And the Valar responded. They called to Ilúvatar, the Creator, and the world was changed. Númenor was destroyed, sank beneath the waves, just like Beleriand before it. The island, the great gift, gone, drowned. Millions of people died, an entire civilization erased. The armada was swallowed by the sea, and the shape of the world itself was changed, bent, made round, so that mortal ships could no longer reach Valinor, could no longer sail the straight road. Only elven ships could make that journey now, only hallowed ships, blessed by those who remembered. Círdan stood on the docks of the Grey Havens when the wave came, the great wave caused by Númenor's fall. It swept across the ocean, crashed into the Gulf of Lune, rose 20 feet above the normal tide, flooded the docks, swept away ships, destroyed buildings. The elves fled to higher ground, watched the water surge, watched it recede. And when it was over, when the sea finally calmed, the damage was immense. Half the docks were gone, 3 ships destroyed, 2 warehouses collapsed, the lower town flooded. And Círdan stood there, grey hair blowing in the wind, and wept. Wept for Númenor, for the friends he'd had there, for Veantur and his descendants, for all the Númenóreans who'd visited over the centuries. All gone now, drowned, dead. Another civilization lost to the sea, and he was still here. Still standing, still enduring. He rebuilt. Of course he rebuilt. That's what he did. The elves worked for months, clearing debris, repairing docks, rebuilding warehouses. It took time, but they did it. And the grey havens rose again. Some survivors came, a handful of Númenórean ships, carrying refugees, the faithful, those who'd remained loyal to the elves, loyal to the Valar. They'd escaped the destruction, fled east, and now they came to Middle-earth, came to the Grey Havens, seeking refuge. Círdan welcomed them, gave them aid, gave them supplies, sent ships to help them establish settlements along the coast. These survivors became the Dunedain, the men of the west, and they founded kingdoms, Arnor in the north, Gondor in the south. And they remained friends of the elves, remained allies, the way Númenor had been at the beginning. Elendil was their leader, tall man, noble, wise. He came to the Grey Havens often, sought Círdan's counsel, and Círdan helped him establish Arnor, helped him organise his people. Because that's what he did. Helped, endured, built. In the year 3429, Sauron attacked again, emerged from Mordor, his forces sweeping across the land, attacking Gondor, attacking Arnor, threatening to conquer everything. And Gil-galad and Elendil formed an alliance, the last alliance of elves and men, gathered their armies, marched to Mordor, to end Sauron once and for all. Círdan sent ships, carried supplies, carried soldiers, sent his own people to fight, and he went himself. Led the forces of the Grey Havens, fought on the plains of Dagorlad, saw the great battles, saw thousands die. The war lasted for years. The siege of Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, lasted 7 years. 7 years camped outside Sauron's fortress, waiting, fighting, dying. And finally, the tower fell. Sauron himself came out, came to fight. And Elendil and Gil-galad faced him, fought him, and killed him. But both died in the doing. Gil-galad fell, struck down by Sauron's heat. And Círdan, who'd known Gil-galad for centuries, who'd fought beside him, counselled him, served him. Círdan watched him die, watched the light go out in his eyes, and felt something break. Gil-galad was the last High King. There would be no other. The line ended. Elendil's son, Isildur, cut the ring from Sauron's hand, took it, and should have destroyed it, should have thrown it into the fires of Mount Doom, but didn't, kept it, claimed it. And Círdan knew it would bring disaster, but said nothing. What could he say? Isildur was king. It was his choice. The armies marched home, back to their realms, and Círdan returned to the Grey Havens to rebuild, to continue. The Third Age began after the last alliance, and it was a slower age, quieter. Fewer great events, more fading. Lindon shrank. Fewer elves remained. Many sailed west after the war, had had enough, wanted peace. The Grey Havens grew quieter, emptier. Círdan walked the docks, and heard his own footsteps echo, saw empty berths, empty halls. The population dwindled, decade by decade, century by century. The great halls stood mostly empty. Dust gathered in corners, cobwebs formed in unused rooms. The workshops were quiet, only 1 or 2 apprentices now. Sometimes none. Círdan worked alone mostly, built ships when they were needed, which was less and less often, maintained the ones that remained, kept everything ready, just in case. The rhythm of the seasons continued. Winter came, snow fell, ice formed. Spring came, ice melted, work resumed. Summer brought fog, autumn brought storms, over and over, year after year, the same, always the same. In the year 1000 of the Third Age, something strange happened. 5 figures arrived at the Grey Havens, came on a ship from the west, a ship from Valinor. Which almost never happened. Ships went west. They didn't come east, but this ship came. And 5 figures disembarked. They looked like old men, bent and grey, wearing robes and carrying staffs. But Círdan saw through the disguise, saw what they really were. Maya, angelic beings, servants of the Valar, sent to Middle-earth to help, to guide the fight against Sauron. Wizards, they would be called, the Astari, 5 of them. 1 in white, Saruman, 1 in grey, Gandalf, 1 in brown, Radagast, and 2 in blue, whose names most would forget. Círdan greeted them, spoke with them, and he looked at the 1 in grey, Gandalf, and saw something, saw wisdom, saw compassion, saw strength that would be needed in the ages to come. And he made a decision, right there, in that moment. He called Gandalf aside, away from the others, and removed Narya from his finger. The ring of fire, held it out. "Take this," Círdan said. "You will need it more than. It will help you in your work. Use it to kindle hope, to inspire courage, to stand against the shadow." Gandalf hesitated, understood what was being offered, the responsibility, the burden. But he took it, slipped it onto his finger, and Círdan felt relief. The ring had been his for 2000 years, and now it was gone. The responsibility passed to another. He felt lighter somehow, freer. The wizards departed, went their separate ways into Middle-earth to begin their mission. And Círdan returned to his work. The centuries continued. Slow centuries, empty centuries. Ships still left occasionally, carrying elves west. Círdan built them, blessed them, watched them go. His routine never changed. Up before dawn, walk the docks, check the ships, work in the workshop, eat simple meals, walk the docks again at sunset, stand looking west as the sun went down. Then inside, to sleep and repeat. Every day. For centuries. The Third Age dragged on. Wars happened elsewhere. In the east, battles between men, the kingdoms of men rose and fell. Círdan heard about it, heard the news, but it didn't touch the Grey Havens. The Havens remained apart, separate, isolated. In the year 1409, the kingdom of Arnor was attacked. A realm called Angmar, ruled by the Witch King, attacked from the north. Círdan sent help, ships carrying soldiers, supplies, weapons. They sailed up the river Lun into the lands beyond. Helped hold the line, but it wasn't enough. Arnor weakened, split apart. In the year 1974, the last king of Arnor fled. His name was Arvedui. He fled north across the ice, sent word to Círdan, begging for rescue. Círdan immediately sent a ship, his fastest ship, best crew. They sailed north along the coast, searching, and they found him. Found Arvedui and his men camped on the ice, freezing, starving. The ship anchored, sent a boat, began taking people aboard. But a storm came up, sudden, violent, winds howling, waves rising, and ice began to shift. Great sheets of ice grinding together. The ship was caught, trapped between moving ice floes. Crushed. It sank. Everyone aboard died. Arvedui, his men, the crew Círdan had sent, all gone, all dead, swallowed by the cold northern sea. When news reached Círdan, when a rider brought word, he said nothing, just stood there, silent. Another loss, another failure. He tried to help, and people had died anyway. But the next year, year 1975, there was revenge. Círdan led forces from the Grey Havens himself, joined with elves from Rivendell, with men from the south. And they crushed Angmar, destroyed the Witch King's realm, drove him away, ended his threat. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. Arna was still gone, the kingdom still fallen. The years blurred together after that, decade after decade, century after century. Círdan continued, maintained the havens, built ships, waited. He was so tired, had been alive for so long, seen so much, lost so much. But he continued, because that's what he did, endured. The late Third Age was very quiet indeed. Almost no one left in the Grey Havens, maybe a dozen elves, maybe fewer. Círdan walked through empty halls, heard only his own footsteps, ate meals alone, worked in his workshop with no apprentices. No one to teach, no one to pass the knowledge to. But still he worked, kept the tools sharp, kept the ships maintained, kept the docks repaired, kept everything ready. Because someday there would be another departure, another sailing, and everything needed to be ready. In the year 3018, Círdan began preparing. He could feel it, sense it. Something was coming, something important. He didn't know what, but he knew. So he built a new ship, the finest he'd ever made. White hull, white sail, every plank perfect, every seam tight. He poured everything into that ship, centuries of experience, millennia of skill, every lesson learned, every technique mastered. He worked on it for months, checking every detail, measuring everything twice, making sure it was perfect. And when it was finished, when the last nail was driven, when the last rope was spliced, he blessed it. Walked around it 3 times, laid his hands on the hull, and spoke words in Quenya. Old words, powerful words, binding the ship to its purpose, preparing it for the journey west. And then he waited. News came slowly to the Grey Havens, but it came. Word of war in the east, of battles in Rohan and Gondor, of Sauron returned, of a ring found, of a quest to destroy it. And then, silence. Months of silence. No news, no word. Until finally, a rider came. The war was over, Sauron defeated, the ring destroyed. And they were coming, the ring bearers, coming to the Grey Havens to sail west. Círdan prepared, loaded supplies onto the white ship, fresh water, food for the journey, blankets, everything needed. He worked carefully, methodically, no hurry, but no wasted motion either. Everything in its place, everything perfect. And then, on a day in September, in the year 3021 of the Third Age, they arrived. Círdan stood on the dock and watched them come. First he saw horses, riders approaching from the east. Then he could make out individuals. Gandalf, the wizard, wearing white robes now. Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, Galadriel, Lady of Lothlorien. And hobbits, small folk, halflings. Some rode horses, some came in a cart. Círdan walked forward to meet them, his grey robes flowing around him, his ancient face calm. He greeted them formally, welcomed them, and indicated the ship, waiting, ready. The hobbits dismounted. One of them was Frodo. The ring bearer, the one who destroyed the ring. He moved slowly, carefully. You could see the pain in his eyes, the weariness, wounds that would never heal in Middle-earth. Bilbo was there too, another hobbit. Very old now, ancient by hobbit standards, leaning on a stick, eager to finally rest. And there was Sam, Frodo's friend, and Merry and Pippin, the other companions. They stood together on the stones, looking at the white ship, looking at the water, looking west. The sun was setting, twilight spreading across the Gulf of Lune. the sky turning purple and gold, the water reflecting the colours. Everything soft, everything quiet. It was time. The ship had been loaded already, supplies for the journey stowed below, the palantir from the Tower Hills, carefully wrapped, safely stored. Frodo said goodbye to his friends. It was hard, so hard. Sam was crying, trying not to, but crying, tears running down his face. Merry stood quiet, trying to be strong. Pippin's face was tight, holding back emotion. Bilbo was already moving toward the gangplank, eager to go, eager to finally rest after all these years. Gandalf embraced the hobbits, spoke to them quietly, words Círdan couldn't hear, words of comfort, of farewell. Then he walked up the gangplank, his white robes catching the last light, his staff in his hand. Elrond boarded, moving with the grace of ages, tall and solemn. Galadriel followed, her presence like a soft glow even in twilight, the light of Valinor already touching her. And finally, Frodo. He looked back once, at his friends, at Sam especially, at Middle-earth, at everything he was leaving. Then he turned and walked onto the ship. Círdan moved to the lines, his hands working without thought. Untying knots he tied and untied 10,000 times, 100,000 times. The ropes came free. The ship drifted away from the dock, just a few feet at first, then more. The wind caught the sail. It filled, billowed out, white against the darkening sky. And the ship began to move, out into the gulf, heading west, toward the open sea. Sam and Merry and Pippin stood on the dock, watching, not moving, not speaking, just watching. The ship grew smaller, smaller. But it never sank below the horizon, never disappeared over the curve of the world. It just faded, grew more distant, following the straight road, the path that went beyond the circles of the world, until they couldn't see it anymore. And then it was gone. Círdan stood alone on the dock. The others had left, ridden back inland. The hobbits had gone. He was alone, the way he usually was. He looked west for a long time, watching the empty sea, watching the stars come out, one by one. Then he turned and walked back to his workshop. The havens were quiet, empty now, just him and the sound of the waves. The fourth age began, the age of men. The elves were nearly all gone. But Círdan remained, still watching, still waiting, still tending the havens. The docks still needed checking, the ropes still needed replacing, the ships, what few remained, still needed maintenance. So he did the work, walked the same paths, performed the same tasks, alone. Every morning he walked the docks, every evening he watched the sunset. Every night he stood looking west, waiting. In year 120 of the Fourth Age, one more came, Legolas, the elf who'd been part of the Fellowship, the one who'd walked with Frodo and the company. He'd built a ship, a grey ship, built it himself in the south, in Ithilien, where he'd made his home after the war. And he'd brought someone with him, a dwarf, Gimli, son of Glóin. Two of them, elf and dwarf, friends, an unusual friendship, an impossible friendship by all the old rules. But they'd walked together through the darkness, fought together, suffered together, and become brothers. They wanted to sail west together, to see the undying lands, to see Galadriel again. Círdan welcomed them, examined Legolas's ship, found it well made, sound, seaworthy. He blessed it, walked around it 3 times, laid his hands on the hull, spoke the words, and watched them sail. Another departure, another goodbye. The ship moved out into the gulf, caught the wind, and faded into the west. Círdan watched until he couldn't see it anymore, then turned back. And still, he remained. The years continued, maybe decades, maybe centuries. The records don't say. But Círdan stayed, maintained the havens, kept everything ready, walked the docks every morning. Alone now, truly alone. The last elf in the Grey Havens, perhaps the last elf in all of Linden. The halls stood empty, silent, dust thick on the floors, cobwebs in the corners. But the docks were maintained, the ships were kept ready, the tools were sharp. Because that's what he did. That's what he'd always done. Endured. And then one day, maybe after years, maybe after a century, he built one final ship. A small ship, just big enough for one. He worked on it slowly, no hurry. He had time. Shaped every plank himself, drove every peg, spliced every rope, sewed the sail with his own hands. And when it was finished, when it was perfect, he loaded his few belongings aboard. His tools, his records, the logs of every ship that had sailed, the names of every elf who'd departed. He walked through the Grey Havens one last time, through the empty halls, through the silent workshops, down the deserted streets. He walked the docks, checking them one final time, making sure everything was secure. Even though there was no one left to use them, even though they would soon fall into ruin, he checked them anyway. Because that's who he was. Then he boarded his ship, cast off the lines, and sailed. Out into the Gulf of Lune, out into the open sea, heading west, following all the others. Following the straight road, the path he'd sent so many along, the path he'd kept open for ages. And when his ship faded into the west, when it disappeared beyond the circles of the world, the Grey Havens stood empty. Truly empty. No elves, no watchmen, no lights in the windows, no smoke from the forges, no sound of hammers, no songs in the evening. Just stone and timber, slowly weathering. The waves kept coming, washing against the docks year after year. The wind kept blowing, through the empty halls, through broken windows, through doors hanging on rusted hinges. Rain fell, soaking into wood that no one repaired. Snow came, piling up in courtyards that no one swept. And gradually, very gradually, the Grey Havens began to crumble. Docks rotted, planks fell into the water one by one, pilings gave way, roofs collapsed, stones fell from walls. The tower, the white tower with its lamp that had burned for ages, it stood longer than the rest. But eventually even it fell, toppled into the gulf, and sank beneath the waves. The gardens went wild. The trees grew unchecked, then died, then fell. The courtyards filled with weeds, then with soil, then with grass, until you couldn't tell there had been buildings there. Centuries passed, maybe millennia. The world changed, became the world we know. A world without elves, without magic, without the Grey Havens. Maybe there are ruins still, hidden somewhere along an ancient coast, stones worn smooth by the sea, timber rotted to nothing, barely a trace remaining. Or maybe not even that, maybe just empty shore, where once there had been harbours, and ships, and the sound of hammers on wood. Where the last elves of Middle-earth said goodbye, one by one, year after year, age after age, until none remained. The Grey Havens, Mythlond, the harbour at the edge of the world. Built by patient hands, maintained through ages, a place of endings, a place of departures. Where the firstborn left Middle-earth behind, and sailed into legend, into memory, into the west. Never to return. The sound of waves on stone, the cry of gulls, the creak of rope, the splash of water against a hull. All of it fading, all of it passing, all of it gone. leaving only stories, only songs, only the memory of a harbour that once stood, where the sea met the land, where the elves met their destiny. The grey havens, where the ships sailed west and never came back. Slow, patient, quiet, the way the elves lived, the way they left, the way they faded from the world, until only the stones remained, and then not even that. Just the endless sea, and the wind, and the memory of ancient voices singing songs of farewell. That's the story. The story of the grey havens, the story of Círdan the shipwright, who endured when others fell, who built when others despaired, who waited when others left, until finally, at the very end, he sailed too, and the age of elves was over. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The grey havens, standing empty at last, after thousands of years. The docks quiet, the workshops silent, the ships gone. All of them sailed west, all of them following the straight road, all of them carrying the elves home. It's a story of patience, of endurance, of work that never ends until it finally does. The kind of story that helps you drift, helps you let go, helps you find rest. Because in the end, that's what the Grey Havens was. A place of rest. A place where the weary finally found peace. Thank you for listening tonight. If you want more stories like this, more deep lore from Middle-earth, subscribe to The Lore Keeper. There are more tales to tell, more quiet corners of Middle-earth to explore, more long, slow journeys to take. Until next time, good night, travellers. May you find your own grey havens, your own place of rest, your own journey home.